Talo, a boy born into a poor family in a small village in Africa, always dreamed of a better life. Every day, his mother, Mrs. Nuru, took him to the fields to work from dawn to dusk. However, Talo always had an optimistic spirit and was eager to learn. One day, while Talo and his mother were working in the fields, he saw a strange bird flying by. Fascinated by the beauty of the bird, Talo ran after it without thinking that he was gradually moving away from his mother and his village. The bird flew away, and Talo, in his excitement, got lost in a completely strange land. Talo tried every way to return to his village, but in vain. He did not know where he was, and the way back to his village seemed like an impossible task. In the early days, Talo had to live in the forest, eating wild fruits and finding shelter under the trees. He faced fear and loneliness, but never gave up hope of finding his way home. After a few weeks of wandering, Talo came across a kind-hearted couple. They were Mr. John and Mrs. Mary, two kind-hearted people who decided to adopt Talo. They took care of Talo as their own son and gave him the opportunity to study at a prestigious international school. Talo's life gradually became more stable, and he began to have bigger dreams for his future. Although living in a new environment full of comfort and prosperity, Talo's life was not simple. Mr. John and Mrs. Mary's biological sons, named Tom and Jerry, were always jealous and envious of Talo. They thought that Talo had stolen their parents' love and always tried to harm him. They played many dirty tricks to make their parents hate Talo, but Talo always endured and overlooked everything. Tom and Jerry often sneaked into Talo's room to ruin his personal belongings. They spilled ink on his books, or his clothes, and even hid his school supply. Every time Talo found out, he would quietly fix it or find a way to replace it without telling his adoptive parents. Not only that, Tom and Jerry also often blamed Talo whenever something bad happened in the house. When something was broken or lost, they quickly accused Talo of being the culprit. Although Mr. John and Mrs. Mary did not completely believe their two biological children, these constant accusations made them suspicious and worried. Once, when there were important guests at home, Tom and Jerry secretly added a lot of spicy spices to the dish that Talo was responsible for cooking. When the guests and family ate it, they were so spicy that they could not bear it, leaving a bad impression of Talo's cooking ability. Despite being blamed, Talo did not complain and still tried to do his job well. Not only at home, Tom and Jerry also tried to harm Talo at school. They secretly put forbidden items such as cell phones in Talo's school bag, causing him to be punished by the teacher and have a bad reputation. Another time, they poured water on Talo's chair before class, making him wet and embarrassed in front of his friends. Tom and Jerry did not stop at small tricks, but went further with bigger actions to bring Talo down. They set up traps for Talo to have an accident. One time, they secretly removed the screws on Talo's bike, causing him to fall while riding on the road. Luckily, Talo only suffered minor injuries. Although he knew who the culprit was, kept quiet and continued to try hard in life. One day, when Talo was preparing for an important school project, Tom and Jerry sneaked into his room and ruined all the effort he had put in. It burned the documents and ruined the model that Talo had spent weeks completing. Talo had to start over, but he was not discouraged. Despite being constantly harmed, Talo always remained patient and never retaliated. He focused on studying and working hard, gradually proving his worth. Tom and Jerry's evil deeds were finally exposed when Mr. John and Mrs. Mary realized the injustice that Talo had suffered. They began to care more and protect Talo from harm. Because Tom and Jerry were spoiled since childhood, they only knew how to play around and not study, so they dropped out of school early and stayed home to depend on their parents. On the contrary, Talo loved to study and always tried his best in everything. He studied hard and achieved many excellent results. Talo's efforts were finally rewarded when he won a scholarship to study abroad. When studying abroad, Talo not only studied hard, but also actively participated in social activities. He always remembered the upbringing of Mr. John and Mrs. Mary and was determined to repay them when he had the chance. After graduating, Talo returned to his home country and met his foster family again. However, he discovered that Mr. John and Mrs. Mary were facing many difficulties due to the huge debts caused by Tom and Jerry. Without hesitation, Talo used the money he earned pay off their debts and took Mr. John and Mrs. Mary to a good hospital for treatment. They were very grateful for Talo's kindness and treated him like their own son. Although he had a stable life, Talo did not forget his biological mother. He started his journey to find his mother, but there was no information about her. While working at a large company, Talo's diligence and hard work helped him to be promoted quickly and then open his own company with many branches across the country. Talo, after being successful in his career, opening his own company and living in a beautiful house, still never forgot his biological mother. Every day he spent time helping people in need, remembering the hard days he had gone through and hoping to find his biological mother. One day, on his way to work, Talo saw a homeless woman sitting on the street, felt something familiar, and decided to approach her to ask. When the woman saw the birthmark on Talo's hand, she immediately recognized that it was her lost son. When she saw Talo, her heart was filled with joy and pain at the same time. She wanted to hold her son in her arms and tell him the truth, but she was afraid that she would become a burden to him. From that day on, she had been secretly following Talo. She sneaked close to the company where Talo worked, looking at him from afar with eyes full of love and pride. Every time she saw Talo coming out of the company, she hid behind hidden corners, only daring to peek. She often picked up small items left behind, such as newspapers or water bottles that Talo had accidentally left behind, considering them precious souvenirs. After a while, Talo began to feel that something was wrong. He saw an old woman often appearing near his company, and her eyes always followed him. Curiosity and a sense of familiarity made Talo decide to learn more about that woman. One day, Talo took the initiative to approach Mrs. Nuru while she was sitting on the side of the road. The woman was embarrassed and lowered her head, not daring to look Talo straight in the eye. But then, unable to hide it any longer, she decided to tell part of her story. Hearing this, Talo's heart pounded. He recalled the faint memories of his birth mother and felt a strong connection to this woman. Mrs. Nuru, tears in her eyes, looked into Talo's eyes and said, "My son has a star-shaped birthmark on his right hand, the only sign that I can recognize him by." Hearing these words, Talo could not contain his emotions. He raised his right hand, revealing the star-shaped birthmark. Talo happily hugged his mother. Both mother and son could not hold back their tears. Mrs. Nuru, although still afraid of becoming a burden to her son, her love and longing for him overcame all worries. Talo took his mother home, introduced her to Mr. John and Mrs. Mary. Together, they took care of Mrs. Nuru and helped her regain her health. Mr. John and Mrs. Mary were also very grateful for Talo's kindness and loved Mrs. Nuru like a family member. Talo's life became complete when he had both his biological mother and adoptive parents by his side. Not long after, Tom and Jerry were unemployed, chased and beaten by gangsters on the street. Talo discovered and rescued them. Tom and Jerry felt ashamed of what they had done to Talo in the past. They knelt down to beg Talo for forgiveness and hoped to make amends. Talo, with his kindness and gentleness, forgave everything and accepted them into his company. From then on, Talo's family, including his biological mother, adoptive parents, and brothers, lived happily together. Talo was not only successful in his career but also became a shining example of kindness and perseverance. Talo's journey is an inspiring story of love, tolerance, and determination to overcome all difficulties in life.